I want to welcome everybody here today. Today's program is The Silent Killer: How a Poor Quality System Could Adversely Impact Your Business, an overview of hot issues in manufacturing and supply chain. This is sponsored by Baker McKenzie. I'm Karen Galley. I'm Vice President and General Counsel at Otsuka America Pharmaceutical, and I'm hosting today's Life Sciences program. So I have a few housekeeping notes. As you may have just heard, this discussion is being recorded and will be available at a later date. Our comments are our own, should not be publicized without permission, should not be construed as legal advice, and do not represent the positions of our company's clients or the ACC NCR chapter. A few features that will help you enjoy today's program. For questions, please use the chat feature and make sure that your chat option is set to all participants. We want this to be conversational, but it can be difficult to break the presentation to answer a question midstream. So feel free to send in your question, and it may be addressed at that moment or it may be addressed later. Everyone is on mute by default to minimize echoes and background noise. If you would like to speak, please unmute yourself. And once you're finished, please remember to mute yourself back again. You're identified on the screen with the name that you logged in with, but please take a moment to go to your thumbnail, click the three dots in the upper right corner, and add your company name. So you're presented with your name and full name and company, and choose speaker view for optimizing seeing the slides. So we're now going to begin the first portion of the program, which is a moderated discussion with our three panelists, and I'll introduce them. Velika Peoples-Dyer is chair of the North American Food and Drug Administration Practice Group for Baker McKenzie, and she's a member of the firm's North American Healthcare and Life Sciences Steering Committee. In over 24 years as an attorney, she has spent more than 20 years providing substantive, strategic, and practical legal, regulatory, and compliance advice and counsel to biopharmaceutical companies around the world. Velika is involved in many diversity and inclusion initiatives and was recently awarded a 3-year appointment to the Corporate Counsel Women of Color Advisory Board. That's a nonprofit organization committed to promoting the career advancement of in-house women of color and supporting global diversity in the legal profession and workplace. Welcome, Velika. Sabrina Mays-Jiang, as of today, is Otsuka America Pharmaceutical's first diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. She is going to be building out Otsuka's DEI office. But as of yesterday, Sabrina was a member of my team in legal affairs as Associate General Counsel, leading the Global Regulated Environments Practice Group in our department. She has a team of attorneys that provided in-house legal counsel to our global teams in regulatory affairs, quality, medical affairs, pharmacovigilance, and safety. She collaborated across business practices and business functions with Otsuka leaders to drive innovative business solutions and to develop strategic plans to ensure organizational compliance with complex global laws and regulations. And finally, Samantha Wilson-Jones is Associate General Counsel at Spark Therapeutics. Samantha joined Spark, the dedicated gene therapy subsidiary of Roche Holdings AG, leading legal support for the corporate functions, including HR, strategy, finance, alliance management, procurement, and corporate communications. Prior to joining Spark, Samantha served as Executive Director, Corporate Counsel at Insight, helping the S&P 500 component biopharmaceutical company build and execute strategies required to take the company global, enter new markets, double its annual revenue to $2 billion, and increase its headcount to 1,400. Her previous experience also includes more than a decade at GlaxoSmithKline, where she concentrated in the area of pharmaceutical product development, manufacturing and supply chain operations, advising on legal and compliance issues associated with complex supply networks, comprised of large internal systems and extensive contract manufacturing operations with annual operating budgets in excess of $10 billion. The breadth of the organizations and business units she has supported throughout her career has deepened her knowledge in areas spanning commercial transactions, GXP compliance, labor and employment law, data privacy, healthcare fraud and abuse, international trade and corporate risk management, and compliance. Thank you all for joining us today in this important discussion. Valika, I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate that. And welcome to all of you, and certainly to my panelists. Thank you so much for doing this with us. We really appreciate it. The agenda today, done our welcome and introductions. We're going to do an overview of CGMP for FDA regulated products. And we thought we'd just do a brief overview. As many of you know, we could spend probably weeks speaking about CGMP, and we have amongst the three of us as we prepared for this panel. And we want to just do a brief overview, recognizing that there's definitely a balance of experience and exposure in the room. We want to make sure we did a quick overview just to make sure we're on the same page as far as what CGMP is. And then we'll talk a little bit about enforcement activity, which is probably one of the most exciting areas for us lawyers, and looking at what the FDA and related agencies are doing. And then we're going to spend some time talking about being proactive, like what can we do to try to help ourselves not fall into any of these, to avoid any common pitfalls, and what types of strategies can companies deploy. Next slide. So of course, this is nothing new to you guys. We know who the FDA is. They're right here in Silver Spring, Maryland, where most of us are, at least Sabrina and Karen and I are in the DC area. And the FDA has a mission. And oftentimes I think it may get lost a little bit, but they are responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety and efficacy of many of the products that we use every day, from our food to our drugs, to our medical devices, cosmetics, and everything else you can think of pretty much that you put on or in your body. The FDA has something to do with that, as a sort of a shorter way of saying it. Because they have this broad regulatory authority over these various areas, it gets to be a bit, complex sometimes when folks are thinking about what does FDA want to know about? What are they concerned about? And so their goal then, very simply then, is to keep unsafe or ineffective products off the market, if you were to just summarize what their real goal is and how to kind of distill that down. And so CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, and we'll talk about the C in a little bit when we get into a little bit more detail, focuses on safety aspects of FDA regulated products. However, you must note that a product that is not manufactured in the course of CGMP could also affect the product's effectiveness. So again, going back to the purpose of the FDA, we want to make sure that we're introducing safe and effective products to the market. So this necessarily means the FDA has a lot of policing to do. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the enforcement section. But certainly, as you can imagine, the FDA does not and cannot, there's just not enough resources. It's not possible for the FDA to be able to test every single item, a product that's on the market, to test the quality of any of those, all of those items. So the FDA put in place CGMP regulations, as well as various guidance documents that provide guidelines for companies to be able to use to figure out how do we make sure that we're introducing safe and effective products to the market. Next slide.
So Valika, just picking up on a few things that you shared, the FDA's role is about protecting and promoting public health and safety. But as you pointed out, they can't be everywhere all the time. But nonetheless, as this slide indicates, the FDA is very active despite their resource constraints. These are just a few examples. We're not intending to discuss them in detail here, but just as illustrative, as an illustration of the types of regulatory enforcement that you'll see from the FDA. And as we're all lawyers here, we often deal in the world of scaring our clients straight. So we just wanted to set that tone with you all today as a first and foremost to really focus in on why this is important. We're not the scientists, we're not the technical people, but what we bring to the table is really helping the companies avoid these types of scenarios where you end up on the cover of a newspaper with one of these headlines. And as we all know, perception often tends to become reality. And so it's not just about the underlying issues with these headlines here. It really is about the perception that you're putting out into into the marketplace. Some of these examples relate to consumer products, some of them relate to pharma products, but it is widespread in terms of the breadth that Valika spoke about with the FDA. And so when you see these types of headlines, the public then perceives whether or not a company or a particular product or a particular manufacturer, broadly speaking, is compliant with CGMP and provides quality products coming out of their facilities. So just something else to take note of here. CGMP is trying to evolve and grow. It is, it's very difficult. It's an evolving area, and things tend to move quicker than the federal government does. And we see no difference with CGMP here. So as you think about some of the newer technologies that are coming onto the market, gene therapies, digital healthcare, personal healthcare, companion diagnostics, they're not all comprehensively covered by CGMP as yet. And so it really becomes incumbent upon the companies to get into the weeds with legal partners to interpret the guidance and the regulations to understand what compliance really does look like and how you drive that in the organization. So today we're going to focus a bit more on the drug side, but again, it's a broad scope and it is very comprehensive, and we could talk about any myriad of these topics, as Valika said, for weeks on end, but we're going to focus in on drugs today, and just wanted to set that context with you. We can go to the next slide.
Sam, before we move on, I just wanted to point out that as we look at these headlines, we generally see illustrations of quality control, a history of quality control violations by pharmaceutical manufacturers. And if we even look back more than 10 years to, for instance, the corporate integrity agreement in 2010 that GSK entered into due to GMP violations at their Sidra Puerto Rico manufacturing plant, some of the same types of GMP violations that were noted in that particular instance are the same type of violations that we see today in 2021, despite that evolution that you're saying in the different areas where there is oversight of manufacturing practices, whether it's in digital health or in the biopharmaceutical space. But I think one thing to note is that, like you said, we can talk about this for days, but some of these things seem to be trends and things that we see over and over again.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about it and we say, what is CGMP? What is it and why does it matter? We can go to the next slide, Sal. So CGMP is intended to give us a broad overview. It's not intended to hold our hand. Oftentimes, if you read the FDA's warning letters and other communications, they will make sure that companies don't forget that their job is not to do your job. Your job is to make sure that you have an adequate and appropriate quality management system. And so just a brief slide here on the regulations. The regulations require that food, drugs, and devices are manufactured in accordance with CGMP, which again, as Sam pointed out, is fluid. And it's a very heavily document-based system. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. Not only is it document-based, it's also verification-based. So those of you who have gone in, for example, and printed out SOPs from a QMOS system that has whatever you're doing, it'll have your name across it and say what time you downloaded it, what time you printed it, what time you saved it. Because again, it is tracking every single action in that quality managed system. And so the regulations then provide us with general standards, as we mentioned earlier. And Sam's going to go through a little bit of those elements. But here on this slide, we talk about part 210 and 211 in the CFR that applies to human and veterinary drugs. CFR 600 applies to biologics. And then there's our QSR regulation for devices. That again, the goal is to make sure that you understand as a company that you have to have these systems in place. And you want to make sure, again, if you don't have those systems in place, the FDA is going to come along, as they do all the time, And they're going to say your product has not been manufactured in accordance with CGMP, and therefore you're introducing adulterated products on the market into interstate commerce, which is a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So again, we don't want that to happen, but as Sabrina mentioned, unfortunately, we see it happen quite a bit. And one of the things that Sabrina and Sam and I spent quite a bit of time talking about was just going into the proactive strategies component that Sam will elaborate on later on, is really getting companies to put in the time, investing the time and the commitment to CGMP so that we can try to avoid continuing to see these trends in the industry and being able to build on the guidance that the FDA has given us across the board. Sam, you want to talk a little bit about the QMS elements on the next slide?
Yeah, sure. I'll go into that, Valika. So a QMS system is very comprehensive, as you can imagine it needs to be. And these are the various elements that make up the QMS or a good QMS system. I won't go into every single one of them in detail, but I just wanted to give you kind of a high level overview and just working our way through them. It starts at the top, if we go clockwise here, with CMOs and vendors. And those are the parties, when you think about a QMS, you're responsible for what your third parties do. And that needs to be top of your mind. So that's why they need to be part of the QMS in terms of your processes and procedures. Risk management, companies should have a formal risk management process in place specific to quality incidents. Moving along, you've got supply chain and compliance oversight. So when you think about your QMS, you should be thinking across the entirety of the supply chain, end to end, not just where the CMOs drop in or where you're getting your APIs from, but your excipients, your distributors, all of those pieces of your supply chain need to be factored into your quality processes in your system. CROs and sites. Typically with your CROs and sites, people are thinking, oh, the clinical team has that. No, there's a piece for quality to do there. You know, there's product handling, storage, things of that nature, again, that you want to make sure from a quality perspective are being handled appropriately. Returns of those products from those sites or collection from those sites if a study terminates early or when the study ends. Also, think about your international operations, not just whether or not you have a location based in a foreign market. If you are getting supplies of any sort from a foreign jurisdiction, if you are manufacturing in a foreign jurisdiction, if you have distribution being handled in a foreign jurisdiction, that needs to be factored into your QMS system. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit there. It also encompasses if you are distributing into or selling into an international market, even if all of your locations, your manufacturing operations are sitting within the US. So it should be a global system. You should always think of it as a global system because manufacturing of pharmaceutical products is global in nature, just based on supply chain and how it's structured. As Valika talked about, your GSP document management needs to be definitely on par, knowing what happened at every step of your processes, who was doing it, should they have been doing it, were they qualified to do it, do you have the right job descriptions, are people doing the right functions? Those are all things that go into your document management and should be factored into your QMS. Your policies, procedures, and quality manual. Again, on the previous slide, we talked about the fact that management has to oversee all of this. And it starts in a lot of instances with, what are your policies? Do you have a quality manual? Your quality manual is typically signed by your CEO, your head of quality, or your head of supply chain operations and manufacturing, and your head of quality. And it brings in that liability for them as well. But because it is policies, procedures, et cetera, you're also drawing in your compliance function and need to be factoring that piece in. Next on the list is your quality checks. Are you self-policing? The FDA is not going to have a problem policing you from the outside, but are you policing yourself? Are you doing your own internal audits? Are you doing mock activities, mock recalls, mock audits, mock inspections to test your systems and see if you have all of the right protocols and processes in place? Then you actually, and you see how much we've gone through before we actually got to GXP. There's a lot that happens before you get to the regulations and the regulatory requirements, but they're there. And they're incumbent upon everyone in the organization, not just folks sitting in quality and not just the lawyers. Everyone is responsible and accountable for this. And it starts from the top down with your management. Then last up on the list, we have training. You know, it's good that you have the policies and procedures in place. Are you training out on them? How often are you training on them? Do you maintain the training records, tying that back into the document management? Where are they stored? Are you training much broader than just the quality organization? So in my experience, when I supported quality, I had to read all those SOPs and and acknowledge and read and acknowledge them, even though I don't have a technical background. And that's a requirement that people touching this space have to be aware of what the requirements are and what the company's processes are that are in place. So again, a lot of information and a lot of content that goes into a QMS system. But what we wanted to point out here is just the complexity of it and the amount of issues and topics that you should be thinking about in terms of putting together a nice, robust QMS system. A couple other things I just wanted to revisit is, again, management bears all responsibility and liability for this system. It's not just the quality organization. There have been instances where CEOs have been deposed around different issues that have come up with quality management systems and other members of the C-suite. So they need to be aware, not just know that it's in place, but know how it works, how it operates, what the system checks are, what they need to do. If an inspector shows up at the door, they need to be aware of those things as well. So they bear a huge burden here in terms of setting the example and casting the shadow in the organization. And then last but not least, quality is not just about the quality organization. Everybody in the company is responsible for the quality of the product getting out on the market, whether you're in marketing, legal, finance, QA, tech dev. Everybody's responsible for having an awareness of the quality aspects that need to be covered off, and the fact that we do have these rigorous programs and these rigorous processes. And you should be cultivating a speak up culture where people may not have the technical expertise, but if they see an issue, they can call it out and speak up and it'll be addressed. And that is also part of what you want to think about in terms of putting together a robust QMS process. Valika or Sabrina, anything to add there?
I was just going to talk a little bit about the management responsibility, and this goes a little bit, Sam, into some proactive strategies that we're going to talk about later. Was, many companies will have a quarterly quality review where the chief teams will get together with compliance and legal and the heads of quality, and they'll talk about everything from recalls to any type of issues with, let's say, batches, production, any type of supplier verification concerns of those. And that is a really good practice for companies to ensure that their executives are made aware, because again, as Sam pointed out, they're going to be held responsible for it. And there is no, I don't know, you're supposed to know, and you have to know. That's a part of the whole point of being in the C-suite at one of these companies. And another point that we spent a little bit of time talking about was really, as lawyers, many of us are involved in transactions, whether we're outside counsel or whether we're in-house counsel, and whether it's an acquisition, a divestiture, an investment, and we're looking at these products that another company may have, and quality is a big part of that. You may see we're reviewing quality agreements, we're looking at the diligence, we're looking at audits, as Sam mentioned, internal audits, external audits, recalls. We're trying to find out what is going on with this particular product at this particular company, and it's important, right? Now, very rarely will you see that, depending on the quality issue, but it's very rare for it to be a red flag, stop the deal type issues. But as we'll go, when we talk a little bit about some of the enforcement, and if you go back through any number of corporate integrity agreements, you'll absolutely see that companies that bought other companies that have had problems, shall I say, they've had quality problems, and they knew when they were buying the company that the company had quality problems. So it was pointed out in diligence, by teams like us. And they said, okay, maybe they reduced the price that they were going to pay and put together a plan and said, we're not going to pay X billion, we're going to pay Y billion. and we're going to work on spending another number of millions of dollars fixing the system. But they're also inheriting not only the system issues, but they're potentially inheriting products liability issues associated with those products. Because again, this all comes down to, if we wind it back up to the beginning of the FDA's mission, this all comes down to, are the products safe? And if we have a quality issue, it is a huge red flag for our friend lawyers that are in the plaintiff's bar, who can form class action suits at any time based on negligence. And they love to point to, I don't know how much they love it, but they point to issues with the quality management system to show that a company is negligent in its production of manufacture of a product. Sabrina, anything there?
This is nothing to add here, but I think it's a great segue into
Absolutely.
enforcement
Mhm.
and into, again, the headlines that we generally see. And the fact that, again, the illustrations that we see are generally show a history of quality violations. So if we can advance the slides to the Hospira healthcare example, and I just want to point out the consistency of violations and the cyclical nature in that. Hospira had received several warning letters and were in trouble with the FDA, so to speak, since 2009. I think they had received a total of 5 warning letters. And then Pfizer came into the picture and acquired them, and I think 2015, knowing, I assume, due to the due diligence that they would have done when they acquired Hospira, that they had these previous warning letters. And when Pfizer acquired them in 2015, they did come up with a comprehensive 2-year plan to address the GMP violations that were cited. However, there were 2 additional warning letters in 2017. And I think this is a classic example of, again, a consistency of violations over time and throughout their global manufacturing system. And so you can see the myriad of GMP violations that were called out. And in particular in their Kansas, their facility in Kansas and in India, there were problems noted in Australia, in Italy, but in particular, at their location in Kansas, it was called out that they had failed to thoroughly investigate unexplained discrepancies or failures of their batches. And I thought it was really interesting when I started taking a look. I mean, I had to clutch my pearls. I'm like, oh my goodness, there was actually cardboard in vancomycin, which is an injection. Can you imagine, as a patient needing a drug and having cardboard in the injection? And what they found during the investigation was that there had been some conclusions made that it was probably cardboard that had come from some vial stoppers, but the FDA noted that they really didn't go far enough to do a thorough investigation or a comprehensive investigation to really understand the source of the problem. Also, with another one of their injectables, they found they had a batch where they saw like 190 visible like particles within the injections. And they took 10 of those samples and sent them off to their lab to be evaluated. But in the report, they noted that Pfizer, again, they didn't go the extra mile to even indicate the scientific rationale for selecting those particular 10 vials for evaluation, nor did they ever explain the nature and purpose of the testing and the examination that they conducted. So again, the FDA pointed out that they really failed to fully investigate the failures in their batches. Also, it was noted at their Kansas site that the firm failed to establish in-process specifications. So actually, if you can imagine, during the manufacturing process, they should have had limits where they would detect, or there would be some alert that they were seeing visible particles within the injections. But they found that the employees, the operators at the plant, were not following the SOPs. They basically ignored when they saw the particles and just, discounted the fact that the particles were there in small or large numbers. Again, they didn't take the time to check, and the FDA was concerned that those injectables actually went out into the market when otherwise, if they had followed their SOPs, those things would have never made it to market. So, as Sam pointed out, it's really important. Everyone has a role in the quality management system, including operators and employees who are at the plant, being trained properly and being able to detect when there are problems and following the company's SOPs. And in this instance, we just saw that there were multiple issues where the operators failed to detect or alert the system that, hey, something is wrong with these products. And again, the FDA cited Hospira for a myriad of violations at various plants around the world. And they noted in their warning letter, of course, that the management team was ultimately responsible for bringing things back into compliance. And I know that their operations were shut down for a while so they could address it. And then that led to product shortages. So, it can be a snowball effect when companies are not following the good manufacturing practices. So anything to add, Sam or Valika?
Yeah, I would just add, when you talk about the snowball effect, it's not necessarily just within your organization. So in the case of Hospira, this rippled out to almost every major pharmaceutical company in the US, if not every single one. A lot of them were all using Hospira. I know the company that I was at during this period of time was using them for a number of products. And so when the plant got shut down, it wasn't just an impact to Hospira, now Pfizer at the time, it was an impact to other parts of the industry, other products that were being produced. So understanding that, even if the company is the manufacturer, there's still ripple effects with the suppliers that are no longer getting the funding because you've now had to stop production, with the workers in those plants that may or may not be continuing to be paid. So just understand that the snowball becomes kind of an avalanche at a point when these failures do build up.
Very good point. Okay, so next slide, let's take a quick look at some of the most common observations or violations that were seen in 2020. Violations around procedures in a quality control unit not being in writing and not being followed. Again, like we just discussed with Hospira, a lack of thorough investigations into discrepancies or batch failures. Also, something that was brought up in the Hospira case, not having controls that are scientifically sound in place, and then production and process controls being should be in writing and followed by employees. And an area where we're seeing that the FDA is beginning to put more focus on is around data integrity. And especially, with the use of electronic data processes, data integrity is very important. So again, like we said, these violations that are common here in 2020 are really no different than some of the things that we've seen in the Hospira case or the GSK case dating back almost 10 years ago or more. Any comments there?
I think, Sam, Sabrina, that's, obviously one of the pieces that's always interesting, because people will say, oh, well, hindsight is 2020, right? It's easy for you guys to look back and note where something wasn't followed. But I disagree with that viewpoint, because that would always be the excuse, right? I do believe that when we read some of these warning letters and other actions, and we see there's no written procedures, that's the problem. Either you had a written procedure or you did not have a written procedure, right? When you see that you have not, and as Sam will talk about later on, again, I talk about being proactive. You have to be proactive, and you want to understand, what do your employees that are actually working in the quality function, that are actually working in the contract manufacturing plant or in the manufacturing plant, or the lab, what do they understand? The only way to really understand what they understand, and quite frankly, what they don't understand, and to get at that and help them, is to have retraining, have mock exercises, mock inspections, and things of that nature. And we've done that quite a bit on my team here at Baker. We've gone out and had mock FDA inspections for companies that really want to try to identify where are their weak points and how do they go about then retraining and reassessing their employees. Because again, it's one of the the circles that Sam mentioned earlier. Having appropriately trained employees is critical. So you can't say, well, my employees just didn't know and they weren't trained, because that is actually a function, a requirement in the quality management system. I remember, and you guys I'm sure do as well, updating your resume yearly and keeping that on file, even as the lawyers, having to keep that on file for the quality management system. And you're thinking, I'm nowhere near touching this product, right? But you are a part of a highly regulated company that has to have all that information and wants to show you have trained employees. So it does, sting us as an industry when we find that many of the same observations are around. But again, our goal is to help you and help your company and your clients try to be proactive about identifying issues and helping them correct those issues before our friends at the FDA or any number of other agencies around the world that have similar policies and procedures come knocking at the door.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's take a look at the nature of FDA inspections in 2020, where we've spent the past 18 months in a pandemic, and where the FDA has been challenged due to travel restrictions to actually have boots on the ground at sites. They have resumed, I think, since July, domestic inspections, but those inspections that would take place abroad, they haven't started those yet, but they're using regulatory tools to be able to do a document-based inspection. And I wanted to call out these 4 GMP violations that we're seeing recently, where companies were called out for GMP violations just based on documents that had been requested by the FDA. So in the first instance, a manufacturer in China showed that they weren't testing materials that were coming into the plant that were being used during the manufacturing process. They also had inadequate testing of finished products. On down to the 4th one here, where they actually put an import alert in place with a Colombia manufacturer because they had similar violations where they were not testing the materials that were coming in, the materials that were being used during the process, and the actual finished product. And so I think all of these illustrate and put us on notice that even though the FDA continues to have a backlog as far as getting inspections completed, and there may be travel restrictions in place, they are utilizing other tools to do their inspections and citing GMP violations just based on documents and records. Anything to add here?
Yeah, I would just add, going back to the training point, when you think about documentation for whether it's for a document-based inspection or in person, or some things you want to think about is how do you go about correcting errors? There should be a process for how you correct a document. There should be a process for what you do if you have a missing document. You can't just recreate it and act like it existed before. As Valika said, when it's coming out of that system, they know what date it was created. And there's an audit trail to the document. And then if you look at these 4 examples, all of the underlying actions are not the responsibility of the quality organization, with the possible exception of number 3, the inadequate cleaning procedures, but that depends on what type of cleaning you're talking about. So these are not the responsibilities of quality people. They're the responsibilities, if you think about equipment maintenance, that's an engineer of some sort. That's not even a scientific person who's, doing the manufacturing. Or again, if you look at the cleaning, that could be routine cleaning of the office. It does not have to be CGMP cleaning. So again, just tying that point back again, it's everybody's responsibility, and everybody has to be properly trained and has to know what they're supposed to do in that environment. And then the other thing that I would point out here is a document-based inspection can lead you to a more in-depth inspection. Again, that snowball can very quickly become an avalanche if they're looking at the documents and they start to get a little weary about what they're seeing. Now you're in full-blown inspection mode potentially.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide and continue this discussion around FDA inspection. Valika, can you take it from here?
Absolutely. And the end point there, we spoke with the last company, number 4, brought up the second bullet here when you talk about import alerts. And so just thinking about an import alert and how, as you can imagine, the FDA is sitting there reading their documents because they're getting ready to inspect. And so you're thinking about the previous inspection history. They're looking around and they're trying to find out information about this product. And if they're seeing that some type of raw materials, excipients, components, whatever it may be, depending on the product, is coming in from somewhere outside the US. And they're looking and they're saying, oh, well, this particular product already has a drug import alert on it. And you guys, and you're not noting that, you're going to get, there's going to be some issues for you as a company in that. And there's an example that we'll talk about later for that. But as they're preparing, they're never going in blind, right? They're looking at your previous history. They're looking at reports. They're looking at communications. If they've been out, they're going to look back at their last visit, certainly to see what happened on their last visit, even though they may be focusing on a different area. When they come, they absolutely going to be looking at, is there something we should follow up on? Like a 483. And 483s, as we know, can be written, but they also always give verbal observations as well, that you should certainly be writing down and taking to heart. And they're going to be looking at, are we making any progress on our CAPAs? If you have a 43, they may have a whole nother inspection just dedicated to following up on that 43 and your real progress. So you can write them monthly and tell them all the amazing things you're doing, but they're going to come out and they're going to want to see that you're doing all these amazing things in your CAPA, right? And what we find is that, sort of like when I was head of compliance, when I was in-house, you're looking at a culture of consistent, continuing non-compliance, right? And so if you have a consistent, continuing non-compliance culture, they're looking at trends, they're looking at how often are we spotting the same types of things with these companies. Kind of, are they listening to the advice that we're giving them? Because we can't create your quality system for you. We've given you CGMP guidelines, and we've come out and we've given you some information. And if you remember, if you guys think about warning letters and other FDA communications, they'll always say something like, this is not all of the issues that you may have at your plant. There may be tons of other things that may be wrong, basically, but we're only pointing out these 5 things, and it's up to you, company, to figure out whatever else it is that may be wrong and make sure that you comply with CGMP. And if you can't, if they determine that you can't, we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about some of the actions, what the FDA can do when they figure out that you just can't get your quality management system together. But they're coming out, and remember, these FDA investigators, they're coming out from the field offices that are nearby, usually within your field, within your area. And they can have and they can bring with them anything that they feel that they need to bring with them, including microbiologists and any other experts. And as Sabrina mentioned, typically they're performing inspections also outside of the US for any products that are marketed and sold in the US. So we know as a country, we talk a lot about America and wanting things to be manufactured in America. I don't think it's possible for everything to be manufactured in America. We know that many, many companies use ex-US contract manufacturing sites for various parts of their supply chain. And they probably will continue to do that, right? As we consolidate businesses into certain companies that are known for being able to manufacture effectively and efficiently and in compliance with the laws, certain types of products. But Sabrina, going over to the inspection history and looking at the manuals used, I talked a little bit about the manuals used. They're going to look at the investigation operations manual. There's a compliance program guidance manual that has procedures that they're also going to look at. And then Sabrina, thinking about the documents that they're going to provide, a little bit about the 42s and 43s.
Well, I'm sorry, there is a myriad, a few documents that are provided during the FDA inspection. The 482, which is signed by the FDA officials and produced by the inspector. And it basically gives the FDA authority to inspect the manufacturing site. So when they come to the facility, they come with that particular notification in hand, and the company should get a copy of that and it should be signed. Then you have the 483, which is the document that's used to list all of the points that have been noticed and observed by the FDA inspector. And they can also note on the 483 previous observations that had been noted in a previous inspection can be added to current 483. Then you have a receipt of samples. During the inspection, if the FDA takes samples from the site, they will issue a receipt reflecting the number of samples that were taken, as well as the lot number that it came from. And remember, while they're on site doing an inspection, they don't have, it's not open season to all of your documents. So they're not going to be looking at promotional materials, labeling, photos, and the such. It's really going to be focused on, certain types of documents that they can look at during the inspection process. And then the affidavit form, which is 483, which is a declaration by production authorities of receipt and use of raw materials used in a product's manufacturing process after an FDA audit. So those are the 4 types of forms or documents that are presented during FDA inspection: the 482, the 483, and the 484.
And we can
You see any of this in real life?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Sabrina started to touch on the scope of the review. And while it is a carefully crafted scope, and in terms of documentation, it limits what they can ask for and what they're entitled to see. But I often, relate back to my criminal law class, and I think about the plain view doctrine. If they see it from a quality perspective, it becomes part of the scope. So they may come in for one purpose, and they see something that triggers that scope to be expanded or triggers a subsequent visit or a longer visit. They may intend to come for a day or two, and the next thing you know, they're there for the entire week. So when you think about the scope, you do have to be, thinking about what is it that they can see? What's in plain view? Yes, here's the documents, and we need to address what they've identified in the scope. But you've had instances where someone walks by the inspector and they don't have on the appropriate safety gear, or they went through the wrong door, or they're carrying something that maybe shouldn't be in that particular area of the plant. All of that could potentially become part of your scope because it's in plain view. So I think that's important to note. When you think about the manufacturing records and what they're actually looking for, you really have 4 things that they're looking for. And you can see the regulatory notations here. But they're looking to ensure that the drugs are being made under sanitary conditions and that they're not contaminated, or, as Valika pointed out, the buzzword is adulterated. When you think about, I've worked in companies where we built plants, and that's a wonderful and exciting opportunity. But some of the nuances that you have to get into when you think about things like that, where's the air vent going to go in the building? There have been instances where 483s were issued because bird feathers were able to get in from an air vent that was on the roof of a building, and it had open slats in it, and the birds made a nest on the roof. And now you've got bird feathers dropping into a bioreactor, and you didn't think about where you put that vent, or the fact that you had the vent over the bioreactor. So you have to think about it a bit more holistically. Where are things in the plant? Where could contamination potentially occur? Where could the unsanitary conditions arise? Not just from people handling the product, but the facility unto itself should also be within the scope of that.
Sam, I even heard during a recent mock inspection where there was a question about the placement of a copier in a particular part of the plant. I was like, wow, the FDA will really look at that?
Yeah,
but
because think about how many people are coming up to use that copier. Should they be in that part of the building? There are a lot of things that factor into what can make the condition unsanitary or contaminate the environment. And then when you think about the processing, packing, and handling of drugs, as we talked about before, and I mentioned this in the context of your CROs and sites, but packaging and handling is very important and needs to be done appropriately and in accordance with the applicable CGMP requirements. If we think about recent news, one of the big stories that came out when we were on the cusp of having COVID vaccines was the fact that you needed cold chain storage, and we need these freezers. Can we get enough freezers? Do we have enough freezers? You couldn't just put the product anywhere. And that could be the case whether you're talking about the finished product itself, the ingredients, the excipients, the API, all of that factors into where you store and how you store materials. In-process materials, et cetera, also have packing and handling requirements. And then you also have these guidances, the draft guidance for compounded drugs and guidance for APIs. The one thing that I'll note here is, yes, there are more and more guidances being added, but in the manufacturing and supply chain space, we are not as blessed as our colleagues in some of the other areas like commercial operations, where you get opinion letters and you can proactively go out and seek advice about certain things that you're going to do. Unfortunately, in our remit, we're kind of left to watch what happens from an enforcement perspective and let that be a guide for whether we do something or we don't do something. So just a note there. We can move on to the next slide unless Valika or Sabrina, you have anything to add.
No, I don't have any.
I don't, as we mentioned earlier, and we knew when we were tackling this, that we could do this for hours on end and probably weeks on end. And I was very respectful of the fact that we've got about 3 minutes left before we go into our breakout. So Sabrina, do you think we could just kind of quickly roll through the enforcement, if those next two slides, and we can go over to Sam to talk about some proactive strategies, because I think that really is where we could give our colleagues some guidance.
Well, after the FDA inspection, there are certain things that happen after that 483 is analyzed. They looked at the observations. We know that the FDA will use publicity to notify the public of the risk of illness and injury associated with a violative drug product. We see that in the news. You just scan the news, you'll see some news clips from this spring related, for instance, to the COVID vaccines, where they use publicity. There's also the untitled letter where there's a notification to the firm of violations that don't quite meet the regulatory threshold of significance, but they will, issue the untitled letter in place of issuing an actual warning letter. Now, when the warning letter comes, that's a notification of an opportunity for the company to take voluntary and prompt corrective action before the agency initiates enforcement action. And then there's the voluntary recall. Remember, a recall can be conducted by a company on its own or at the behest of the FDA. And again, that's where the company takes voluntary action to remove its defective product from the marketplace. And then the FDA's responsibility is to oversee the company's strategy, monitor the public messaging, notifications downstream, and also assessing the adequacy of the recall. Next, here are some potential consequences that can flow after the inspection: the administrative detention of products, the seizure products, injunctions, and debarments. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Sam, because we have 1 minute.
Sure. So there are also, we can go to the next slide. There are also some additional ramifications. And the headline here is just that it doesn't just stop at the FDA. Now, we probably have all seen that the federal agencies don't tend to talk to each other when it's in our best interest on the front end, but they do tend to talk to each other on the back end once there's been some sort of enforcement action taken. And so just a note to point out that there could be other consequences beyond just other ramifications beyond just what the FDA has within its remit of enforcement, whether it be the SEC, the Department of Justice. Again, if you look at the headline slide, the GSK situation, they had a consent decree that was coming out of the DOJ. So just keep that in mind, that it extends beyond enforcement and the consequences extend beyond the FDA. We can go to the next slide. And one more. And so we talked about a number of these processes, but we basically broke this down into 3 steps that companies can take. And step number 1 is having a robust quality management system. We already spoke about executive management's responsibility and liability associated with the system. So having that a good, robust system in place is really what gives you that assurance of being able to avoid some of these pitfalls that we've seen and discussed today. It should be designed to direct and control how quality compliance is implemented and how you actually go about achieving that in the organization. And it should be tied to business initiatives. Again, it's not just about the quality organization, it's about the entirety of the company. Next slide. Again, we looked at the QMS elements. A couple of things that I'll point out here is the fact that this is not just about quality. There are, we go back to the QMS element slide. One more. If you think about all of these elements, they involve a number of different functions, and we talked about some of them. Compliance is involved, the commercial operation are involved, clinical operations are involved. You have external third parties, and then management's responsibility, and then just the entirety of the organization in terms of the speak up culture. So again, when you think about a robust system, think more broadly beyond just the QA folks. Next slide. Step number 2 is staying ready. Again, we've talked about this already, and here are just some examples of the types of things that we've mentioned that companies can do to stay ready. If you think about the audits, the internal audits, self-policing, checking on your third-party vendors, and then you can actually have third-party vendors come in and audit you. You can hire third parties to come in and conduct audits. You should be doing some mock exercises to practice and see where your pitfalls are so that you can correct for those. Pre-inspection, you should be thinking about who's on the team, and the team should include legal. No, we're not necessarily the technical experts, but we should be a partner to the business in terms of thinking through some of these issues and being able to advise them based on the enforcement action that we're seeing and the trends that Sabrina spoke about. We've spoken quite a bit about document management, so I won't go into that. And then after the inspection takes place, again, who's your response team? Legal should be on the response team. We should not be holding the pen when it comes to writing those responses, but we should be reviewing them to make sure that they are well crafted and written in a way that does not bring further exposure to the organization. And then again, we've spoken about document management and the CAPA process. Next slide. And last but not least, step 3 is just being agile. I think what we've seen in these last 18 months is that we need to be flexible and we need to be fluid and we need to evolve in terms of how we think about quality. What are the databases and technologies that we're using? Do we have the right systems in place? Whether it's a QMOS or whether you're using ComplianceWire or any of the other vendors. And then also thinking about systems integration. To validate or not to validate is often the question. When you validate, yes, when you require validation in a system, it requires a bit more rigor than you might have in your typical learning management system or processes like that. But having that validation in place means that it already covers the GXP components, and you don't have to maintain 2 separate systems within the organization. And then what we've seen in COVID is this virtual modeling where virtual inspections were being done. Yeah. If we have that technology to afford us the opportunity to showcase what's going on in the facilities, why not use that to our advantage where we can monitor what's going on? We can do our own auditing and self-policing using that technology. And then just a few lessons that we've learned during COVID. Virtual inspections are likely here to stay. As Valika spoke about, the FDA's resources have always been constrained. And now that we've actually modeled the ability to do these virtual inspections, I don't know that they're necessarily going to leave us. So we need to adapt and be prepared for that. And I'm sure that'll bring about some new trends in terms of some of the violations that might come to bear. The other thing is just supply chain complexity. As Valika spoke about, we're probably never going to get to a nationalized system. There's no way we can make every single component that goes into a product in the US. And so we need to recognize the complexity that goes into this. And we learned that with COVID, where you had stockouts and shortages and things of that nature, because things were coming from countries that were otherwise impacted either before or after we were, or during the time that we were impacted most significantly by COVID as well. And then finally, just the heightened public awareness. Again, we already spoke to the fact that those public notices are being put out there. Well, COVID has now heightened that awareness because we were all sitting at home doing nothing but watching the news and looking at the news feeds on the various social media platforms. And now people are thinking more about, where's my drug coming from? Who made it? Is it safe? If you think about the shift that happened in personal health care, where patients went from relying on what their doctor said in terms of what the course of treatment should be to going in now that they've seen DTC ads and saying, well, can we try this drug? Well, I saw a commercial about that drug. And now the doctors had to respond to that. I think the same thing is likely to happen with pharma, where people have now increased their level of awareness, or they're paying more attention to the industry. And I think there's a little bit of a PR campaign that might need to come in the aftermath of COVID to ensure that people understand the rigor that goes into making a drug safe and in an efficacious manner. Valika, I will turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I know we're a little bit over, but I wanted to make sure that Sam had a chance to walk through the proactive strategies, and we thank you for your time and for your attention. We will absolutely be providing you with the slides so that you can look at them in more detail, and certainly our contact information. And we definitely appreciate your time and your attention. I know that some people had to leave. Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and they'll be able to see these types of things in the selected FDA guidance documents, will be in the document as well, for you to be able to just look through some of that and refresh your mind on some of those particular issues. Karen?
Thank you, Valika. Thank you, Sabrina and Samantha. It was